Welcome back to God's Lawyer Podcast. Why do men not want to go to church? Well, I think part of the problem is men's ministry and the way we've approached it for the past 30 years. So let's talk about, in this episode, how we can rethink, biblically that is, men's ministry and what it should look like in the local church. That is, if we want to attract strong, capable men who can be trained and deployed to go out and make Christ known.
There's not a time zone in which he's not being praised. Listen to me, there is not a moment since the resurrection of Jesus where there's not someone somewhere declaring that Jesus saved.
Well, when I think about men's ministry, often the image that comes into my mind is probably more of that like the scene in the Titanic. So you think about it, the Titanic's going down, and you say, why are you choosing that particular scene? Well, because there's an undergirding philosophy. There's a foundational philosophical system or way of thinking that really kind of undergirds most men's ministry, and that is really that the ship is sinking. So when I think about men's ministry in the, if you will, run-of-the-mill evangelical Protestant church, it looks something like that scene, where you have basically the ship's going down and you have a few men on the deck, they're playing, they're in the band, and they're saying, well, it's going down, let's just go ahead and play some music. They've kind of just given up and they're just going to hang out and have fun until the end, I guess. Then you've got those who are trying to get women and children onto the boats. There's clearly no leadership because half the boats are really not fully occupied. There's so many more people that could get on there. Then you have some cowardly men trying to jump on. You have some officers trying to keep order, and basically it's just utter chaos. Really, no one has any direction other than we're just trying to save a few people here. The whole ship's going down. Well, that sort of image really kind of undergirds most men's ministry today. We no longer are teaching and training men how to fight and how to win, and that's a problem. We're basically recruiting men into men's ministry, and we're just, not only are we directly telling them that you've joined the losing team, that we are losers, we take kind of a loser approach and loser mentality to men's ministry. We don't really adopt the biblical principles of what it means to be a strong, capable man. Now, I don't mean by strong, capable man that the only strong, capable man is a man who hunts deer and then field dresses it right there. Now, I don't mean that. Now, listen, I know a lot of capable men who hunt deer and field dress them, okay? I grew up around deer hunting, went with my father many times. It's not something as an adult that I've necessarily felt drawn to. So I'm not talking about these predetermined categories that we may look at in society. Here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking in terms of the biblical mandate, what that looks like. So let's go to a different image. Since we were at one ship, let's look at a different ship. Let's go back and let's think about the Greek ships that were used to defeat the Persian Navy. The Persian Navy was vast and large, and the Greeks had designed these ships. They're very interesting when you think about the design. So in the design, it requires that you have three levels of rowers. Now, if you look at, you might think there's just one kind of level of men rowing, but actually the way it's built, it's very interesting. Why? Because the boat is built for warfare. Okay, it's not built for cruising or entertainment or sailing. You might think of even the local church days. The local church there to conduct warfare. And by the way, what I mean by warfare is spiritual warfare. And so, yes, it is there for that. However, most churches and their ministries are structured more like a cruise ship. So let's go back and think about this Greek ship, and I want to try to draw some parallels here to some biblical principles, and let's talk about developing a healthy, strong, vital men's ministry. So when you go and you think about the ship, so it had three levels of rowers, and it's interesting because the lower level, they're kind of closer into the middle, and then you've got that mid-level rowers, they're kind of where you would expect them to be stationed, and there's a spot for another level or layer of rowers. And this would mean that the ship could move quickly. It could also do this, it could change direction. And then on the top deck, you would have what we might think of in the terms of Marines. This is where Marines really came from. They were the fighting men on the decks of the ships. So we would think of them as kind of like Marines. These are men that you would see already in the battle attire. Would include men are throwing spears. You have archers, a couple others. You'd have a few what we would call officers kind of guiding, one at the front, one at the back, a few others. You'd have some leadership guiding the rowing and the, if you will, the count and the cadence of that. And these men are working together as one unit, and their goal is to defeat the enemy. And so when you think about that imagery, and I think about these younger generations of men now, young men coming up, that sort of imagery, that strong, vital, if you will, picture of a man who is part of a fighting unit, who is operating and conducting themselves in a way that each man to his left or right is counting on him, and there's times he's going to have to row hard. He's going to have to use everything that he has. He's going to have to fight. And by the way, when that boat slaps up against another one, and the rowing is in some senses disabled, let's say you're hemmed in, then everyone is up on the deck fighting. Okay, you can't just stay below deck and hide. Everyone's got to come up and fight. So when I think about that image and that imagery, I'm drawn back to this dichotomy. Either it's a cruise ship and it's going down and let's just have fun until the end, save a few if we can, versus kind of a battleship. And I want to talk about a few principles that I think are important, not just in developing men's ministry. These are important for men's ministry, but this is important for men. And we think about the friendships and relationships that we have. I want to talk about these biblical principles, but I want to draw your attention to the book of Proverbs. I want you to think about this. We often say, well, I'm going to read a proverb a day. And we treat it as if it's a book that's kind of just a random collection. Now, while the book is a collection of wise sayings from several different, if you will, wisdom teachers, remember that the book is inspired. That means its collection, the editing, the compiling of it is inspired by God, and it's placed in a particular order. And in this order we start out with, it's very interesting, because we might jump into verses. I know a famous verse that many people will say, if you spare the rod, you'll spoil the child. And they use that verse as saying, well, this should encourage parents to use corporal punishment. And this isn't a conversation about whether you should spank your children or not. You should not ever abuse your children, so we can go on the record saying that. But the point of this episode is not whether you should spank your children or not. But what I find interesting is when you take that verse and you pull it out of the book of Proverbs, it has one meaning. But when you read it within Proverbs, the book of Proverbs is a call from a father to a son, and we would say, a parent to a child, but particularly here, a father to a son, to heed his wise words. In fact, he says this, "Hear my son, your father's instruction, forsake not your mother's teaching." So again, it's not just a father, but here a father is leading. Certainly the son's mother has a great deal to contribute to his life and to teach. I know that the mother of my children is very wise, and she has a great deal to offer to them and to me. But the book is laid out, if you will, as this guidebook. It's a conversation. Really, it's the way it's structured. It's a conversation between a father and a son, and a father's laying out all these wise principles. And you can think about it, even when you get to the end, you have the Proverbs 31 woman who, we think about this, and this is something that you hear almost pretty much every Mother's Day. It's like a standard sermon that has to be preached. But when you get to that point in the book, what we do is we pull it back, and I think what we need to do is go back and recognize here's a father instructing his son, and he's basically telling him, here's the kind of wife you should be looking for. Wow. Okay, that makes sense now. So going back to the beginning, kind of the opening here, he lays out some wisdom principles in the first 7 verses. And I think verse 7 is a nice transition where we hear the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, fools despise wisdom and instruction. And so who are our primary teachers? Now, can I for just a moment kind of jump into something on some parenting stuff, okay? So I want you to understand this. So our primary teachers are our parents. Now, when we think about it, they're not our only teachers, but they're our primary teachers. There's something that happens in the maturation of children that while the parents, when they're younger, the kids are excited to learn, they want to learn everything they can. Then they get to this point where there's what we call the rebellious stage where, parents really don't know what they're talking about. Parents are the worst thing that ever happened. You always have the worst parents and this sort of thing. You kind of go through that, and then the children come out of that, hopefully, with only a few bruises, and they come out of that and they start realizing, and particularly when they become parents, they start realizing, wait a minute, I've got to impart a lot of wisdom here. And then they start tapping into their parents who are now grandparents. I certainly have lived that myself, so I understand. So understand what's happening here in the book of Proverbs is a father's passing on wisdom to a son. Now, this isn't the only relationship where we're going to have wisdom passed on. We think about the church as a family, as the household of God. And we think about the older men. Paul tells Timothy, don't rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, the first and second verse of the chapter there. So when you think about this household imagery, now let's say you've got men in the church they've not been mentored. They didn't have a father who was in the faith or strong in the faith or mentoring them in godliness or godly principles. Well, where are they going to turn? They should be able to turn to the church, and the church should have should offer them opportunities to be mentored by godly men. Now, when you think about it, though, the average men's ministry, it doesn't feel very manly. In fact, in some respects, it feels somewhat counter-biblical. We think about it. So the average men's ministry is going to only focus typically on the spiritual. Usually they look something like this: let's all show up and gorge ourselves. Let's celebrate gluttony as a sin. Seldom do you hear even the slightest rebuke over that matter, or it is a very emotional-driven ministry. Recently, I saw some pictures of some men at a men's ministry event, and they were getting manicures and pedicures done. And I thought, wow, I mean, I'm sure, I guess if that's your idea of men's ministry, I think that it is part and parcel to what we're seeing in culture is this whole idea of the effeminate man. So, and when you think about men's ministry and what it means to have mentors and friends, godly mentors, godly friends in the church, it means more than once a month showing up and gorging yourself at a breakfast. It means more than just going and doing basically effeminate events. I would say that if you're doing an effeminate event, you're really not doing men's ministry anyway. That's somewhat of a joke. So let's talk about this. What should be the goal of men's ministry? The goal of men's ministry, let me be very plain. If this is not the clear, definitive goal of men's ministry, you're not doing a biblical men's ministry. I had a man years ago tell me he was an expert on men's ministry. He's an expert on it, made all sorts of claims, and couldn't back any of it up. Had no data, no support. Basically, it was just a Bible study. And there's nothing wrong with a Bible study, but men's ministry is more than just the spiritual. It should have physical component, the spiritual component, and the mental component. Why? Because men are not just spiritual beings. We're physical beings. We also have our mental faculties. The mental would include, I think, the emotional. There may be some overlap there with the spiritual. So when I think about this, the goal should be recruiting men and training them to win. Well, I would say recruiting men, training them how to fight and win. There it is. Going back to my reference to this expert on men's ministry, I looked over his documents, and one of the things he said was, we have to help men have an intimate relationship with Jesus, using effeminate language, using language that most men are going to be, well, I'm just going to be honest with you, a little taken back. They're not going to be comfortable with that. Why? Because God created us to be leaders, to be strong, to understand friendships with other men. There's certain boundaries, and certain language should not be used. If not, we're adopting a cultural view of masculinity that is antithetical to Scripture. So if you're in a men's ministry and they're talking like that, you're not in a men's ministry. It's some sort of ministry, but it's not a biblical men's ministry. It's not based on biblical manhood. So biblical ministry that has the goal of shaping and discipling men must have as its clear goal recruiting men and training them how to fight and win. I'm going to say that one more time. A biblical men's ministry has as its goal recruiting men and training them how to fight and win. Now you say, is this going to be like a jiu-jitsu class? I'll be honest with you. That's not where I'm going with this. That's not my primary thing. It's not like how to win a fist fight. But I can tell you this, part of what's lacking in men's ministry are inherently masculine things. So if you were to tell me at your church that part of your men's ministry is once a month, they've got a jiu-jitsu class, I'm thinking that's good. Now, if your men's ministry only has like jiu-jitsu class and stuff like that, then I'm gonna push back and say I don't think that's really a men's ministry. It just sounds like you got a bunch of bros getting together who are into MMA. Okay, fine. So let's talk about this. Number one, men's ministry must have a biblical worldview at its foundation. And a biblical worldview, a biblical manhood, sees men as leaders, as conquerors, as adventurers, as workers, and as warriors. I sometimes get these messages from people, talking about warriors for Christ, but there's no warrior in their walk. So, I mean, anybody can go get, a warrior bumper sticker or a warrior tattoo. But I mean, if you're not living the warrior life, don't hashtag that thing. So the warrior mindset is a conqueror mindset. It's an adventurous mindset. It has within its biblical manhood has within its idea of creating and conquering. Okay. Now, some of you are going to read into this like, okay, is this like a call to physical arms? No, I've made that clear in a number of podcasts. And so if that's who you are and you're listening to this podcast and that's what you're hearing, you're either ignorant or you're willfully deceived and willfully deceiving yourself. Biblical men's ministry recognizes that God created men to be conquerors, to be leaders, to be creators, to be workers, to be productive, to be warriors, and to have that adventurous mindset. And if you don't understand that coming in, basically you're not going to develop men's ministry. You're going to develop an opportunity for people just to be gluttonous and continue to participate in sins of the flesh. If you're not willing to confront men, they don't have mentors, they're not willing to have hard conversations. Well, second, we need to recognize that men, biblically speaking, are created to be multipliers. They're created to be multipliers. Bottom line, how do they multiply? By being husbands and fathers. First and foremost, by being husbands and fathers. Now, when we think about this idea, we see this in true masculinity, but we also see it in its fallen, unbiblical application, in that men seek to be multipliers and that men seek to conquer other kingdoms and convert men to their rule or to their way of thinking in their system. Biblical men, yes, we are called to be multipliers. First of all, it's through being a husband, then through being a father. And so we are multiplying in our home under the headship of Christ the King, his kingdom, as we are preaching and teaching the gospel to our wives and our children. But we're also to be multipliers in the sense that our goal should be to convert other men, and converting other men to the kingship of Christ, converting them through the preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And by doing so, then the goal would be to see their households become part of the kingdom by professing faith in Jesus Christ. So we need to recognize men are created to be multipliers, okay? Now, I'm going to tell you this. I'm going to just hit pause. And if you know a young man that's struggling with we might say, mental health issues, okay? Here's I think one of the causes of young men struggling with mental health issues is because that we lack this image of strong men, of strong biblical men. They're looking around, and what we've done is you let your child sit on video games, you let your son sit on video games 8 or 12 hours a day, for 7, 8, maybe 12, 15 years of his life. Then all of a sudden you expect at 18 he's going to be able to handle tough things. Listen, I will never make an apology for the fact that I believe that part of loving your children is that you create an environment where there's high expectations. And creating an environment where there's high expectations means that when they can't limit or control things, you limit or control it for them. Now, you might say, well, then, they're going to hate you for that. Okay, my job is not to create an environment where I seek affection. So leaders should not be seeking affection. Now, certainly I want the affection of my wife and I want my children to love me. However, my responsibility is first and foremost to Christ Jesus, and I'm to raise my children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. Their response to that as adults is on them. My responsibility, now, certainly that means you love your children. Absolutely. You love them, you work hard, you sacrifice for them. So when you think about this idea of being a multiplier, you should be creating an environment where these young men can grow up and be men. And the reality is that, listen, father, sometimes you're going to have to look to their mother and you're going to have to say, okay, I need you to, you talk about it privately behind the scenes. You say, I need you to step back from this, okay? Don't enable this. I can think about this, I had a couple come up to me and the lady's enabling her son. He's now in his late 20s, living at home, refused to ever require anything of him. And, Now he's got a kid, and grandma's now paying the bills, and you wonder what's going on with all this anxiety and depression and mental health issues with our young men. It's because we've told them, a real man's not a conqueror, he's not an adventurer. He's somebody that basically sits around, puts on hundreds of pounds of body fat because he's not physically active. He's mentally inept because he doesn't read. He's not pursuing wisdom. He's spiritually either dead or weak because he's not being trained in the Word. And then we wonder what's wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm making this matter plain. We know what's wrong. So let's talk about how to fix it. So we need to recognize that men are created to be multipliers. Okay, that means that there needs to be a very clear example from another man what that looks like. That starts with the father. For some, you don't have that in a father. So the church provides that. Okay, the church provides that for you and should provide that for you. I'm not saying every church does. The church should provide that for you. So the church should be providing you father-like mentors in the faith, but also we need to teach these young men what it looks like to have men who are friends. Because if you think about it, the invasion of homosexuality into the church is because, frankly, we've not taught men what it means to have a godly friendship with another man. It's kind of an all or nothing extremes here. Either we have men who, to the one extreme, you will never share even the slightest emotion, and then you've got to, because it has to be this masculinity that is so far gone from a biblical view that, to what it means to be tough is to never really have a friend and keep everything inside, and then we have issues where we have men taking their lives. Okay, that's dangerous. Then over here we have the other extreme where a friend is this effeminate, very weak, whiny, weepy individual. You have these extremes. So let's talk about what it means in a biblical ministry to have covenantal friendships. That means this: that look, when a brother in Christ shares something with you, you keep your mouth shut. You don't betray his trust. You stand with him. This whole hashtag Warriors for Christ stuff, and you don't stand with a brother, that means nothing. You stand with a brother through thick and thin. You have his back. That's what it looks like. You stand shoulder to shoulder with him. He can count on you. He knows, hey, here's the kind of guy I can give him a call. Hey, if I need help, with fixing my fence, I can call this guy. If I'm struggling with some mental issues, I can call this guy. Why? Because he's a trusted friend. The book of Job really kind of opens up this idea of friendship as a covenantal relationship. And Job's friends had really kind of, in many respects, kind of broken that covenant of friendship. Friendship in the ancient world was considered as a covenant. It's binding. We need to get back to that. I mean, today, the slightest offense, you hurt somebody's feeling. Can you imagine this? I never thought I would see this growing up, that when I became an adult. Like if a man hurts another man's feelings, like you don't speak to the man anymore. You're not friends, or you go talk about him behind his back. Part of being a man is developing emotional maturity, then understanding that you can have a godly friend who just tells you the truth, shoots you straight on it, and you need to be able to take it. Okay? So, biblical friendships. Let me close with this. I think there's 3 things that have to be part of your life, and because they need to be part of your life as a biblical man. And by the way, if you're a woman, you're watching this, you need to understand, you need to encourage these things in your husband's life. Okay? You need to tell him, look, you need to set the standard. You need to set the expectations high, and you need to embody it, okay? So it's time. I mean, listen, it's just a wake-up call. Men, you need to embody this. Men, you need to embody it. Ladies, if you're watching, you need to challenge your husband to embody these things, okay? He's never going to embody them perfectly, okay? So you're going to need to be patient with him. Fathers, you need to embody these things. And mentors, you need to embody them. Why? Because we want to have an influence on younger men. Here's the thing. In biblical ministry, like your life as a man, should have 3 foundational components, okay? In not any particular order, because they're all equally important. You get these ministries that are only talking about the spiritual, and they don't deal with the physical, and then the mental. And the mental, I think, is going to have 2 components for me. It has the intellectual and then kind of the emotional component. So it needs to have a physical component to your men's ministry. I'm proud that the church I currently pastor, the men's ministry, they have a number of physical events that they participate in. I think once a month they go out on what they call ruck marches. And let me tell you something, that's a good thing. Why? Because it's reminding men that God created us to sweat. Yes, that's right. He created us to sweat. So you might have a job that's not labor intensive. I have 2 jobs. Neither are labor intensive. And I can tell you this, if I simply just sat around and I didn't have physical activity, one, I'm dishonoring God, because he's told me to steward well my life, that the body's the temple of this Holy Spirit, to steward well my life. So in stewarding well my life, that means that I then have to insert physical activities into my life so that I can maintain some physical health. Now, I don't know how true this is. The other day I looked on this app. My wife got me this watch, and I looked on this app because I try to do a lot of physical training and not a lot of running, but a good amount of running. And then my resting heart rate stays about 42 to 44 beats a minute. And according to this app, it says that my physical health, they calculate it, and I also have an app where I put in what I eat. And there's this joke. My wife tells everybody I don't eat sugar, and that's all I eat. Well, it's a funny joke, but it isn't actually true. I don't just eat sugar. That's because I don't eat meat. And by the way, I don't have a problem with people eating meat. I think it's appropriate. It's just a health decision that I've made for myself. And so she says I just eat carbs and sugar. Again, it's funny, but it's not necessarily reality. So I limit. I've got an app, and 6 days a week I limit myself to 1,800 calories. I also set my goal every single day, with the exception of Sunday, for 10,000 steps. That requires me to run and to walk to get to that point every day, and then I do physical training 4 to 5 days a week through some weightlifting or something like that. So the app said my physical health is the equivalent of being 29 years old, and I'm 47. So I was like, okay, wow, that's impressive. Now, that's not the standard. I'm not saying that's the standard. I'm not saying I'm the standard. What I'm saying is that the physical component is a very important part of my life. And I've also recognized that when I'm doing physical activity, I don't really understand what's going on, but apparently there are chemicals that are being produced in my body that allows stress to be reduced in my life. It also gives me energy. And that's more of a sustaining energy through the day. You might say, well, it makes me tired. But actually, once you get part of a routine, it makes you stronger, and it gives you more vitality through the day. Okay? And then, of course, you sleep better. All right, so enough on that. You kind of get it. You say, where do I start? Well, I mean, this episode will come out in this new year. Actually, I'm recording it on January 1st of 2025. So it'll come out shortly thereafter. So men's ministry should have a physical component. Why? Because we should be challenging men to honor God and steward God with their lives. It should have a spiritual component. Yes, we should teach men how to pray. That's very important. Men struggle with praying. I'm telling you, prayer is one of the weakest parts of a man's life. Now, I've noticed as men get older, they become like spiritual giants in their prayer life. We need to teach younger men how to pray. And I think we've got to shift from this idea of always, basically, praying, God help my neighbor's bad knee, help my aunt with her bunion, to prayers like this. Lord, I am your servant. What is your will? Show it to me that I would faithfully execute it today. Give me the strength, the wherewithal, the fortitude to carry it out. When I feel weak, I pray that your grace would be sufficient in my life. I pray that I would recognize that grace. And, getting in the Word, Lord, help me to understand this Word. These are prayers that you should be praying. Help me understand this Word so that I can live it out faithfully. Help me to love my wife. We need to teach men to pray like this. Lord, guard my eyes, that I would not lust after other women. Guard my heart, that it would not be filled with lust. Give my heart a great appreciation for my wife. Help me, even in the difficult times as a father, to hold the line, to not give up. If we teach men to pray like that, watch how their prayer lives change. Lord, help me, give me the ability, the strength, the courage, and the energy to work even harder at my job, that I would glorify you in the work that I do, stuff like that. Watch how that's going to happen. So the spiritual, it also includes a component of the intellectual, because there needs to be some reading, what's coming in, this sort of thing, contributing to the overall mental, spiritual health of a man, which I think also is directly correlated to physical health. You can't be physically unhealthy and think you're going to be mentally and spiritually healthy. And listen, I'm not saying everybody needs to run out there. I'm going to go back to this physical thing. I'm not saying every Christian man needs to run out there and become a bodybuilder. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying this, listen to me, brother in Christ, you need to get active. That means you every day you going for a 30-minute walk, then do it. Get a bike. Whether it's one that's stationary or one that's outside, I think you're better off to get outside, get out in the world. Find something physical that you can do. It's essential. Why? I think too, as you get older, you want to be physically sound the older you get, so that you can continue to be used by God to minister to your family and continue to be productive in the kingdom. Finally, the mental component. The mental component has an intellectual pieces. Listen, God created men. We're not these bumbling idiots like television presents us, okay? That modern television presents men. Men are capable. They are thinkers. They should be challenged to be thinkers. We aren't just grunts that scratch and fart. Although that seems to be inherently part of manhood. I don't know. But men were created to be thinkers. We're created in the image of God. And so if you're not reading, and look, you might say, I don't have time to read, then get audiobooks. Get on some podcasts. And podcasts alone aren't going to be enough. I'm just going to tell you that right now. You're going to need to get, if you don't have time to sit down and read a book, but here's the thing is, if you could just read 20 minutes a day, every day, how many books do you think you'd get through in a year? You're probably going to get through 10 books in a year. Now, obviously, if you go and get massive books, whatever, but average size books, you can get through 10 a year, reading 20 minutes a day. The other part of the mental is that emotional piece. Is look, you got to have a couple good friends, and you can't be this guy that's always whining, okay? But if there's some issues, call a friend and let him challenge you, on this matter. I've got a couple friends I know I can call. Hey, here's what I'm struggling with, and look, they'll tell me, hey, man, you're just going to have to get through it. Hey, don't worry that you're going to overcome this. And then sometimes like, okay, listen, man, I'm praying for you. And this is serious, okay? Help you think through this. So you need those. You got to have those couple friends. It helps you mentally. You got to have some sort of, you can't just bottle this stuff up. You got to have a couple friends that you sit around and talk about, like, hey, here's some challenges I'm facing. And I'm going to tell you this, one of the things, I just want to kind of hit a side note. Can I just hit a side note here for real quick before we end on this men's ministry? Because there's the issue, and it's kind of a subcategory here, but it's an important category, and that is lust and pornography. I've had a couple young men here recently come and tell me, say they're addicted to porn. And I'm going to tell you, I think that language is just completely wrong. I think, again, that goes to this whole effeminate approach to men's ministry. First of all, who are they to diagnose themselves, and where did we get these sort of diagnoses from, okay? So look, here's the reality, and I think we've got to talk about this in men's ministry, is that God created men in a way that we want to pursue a woman. Okay, we need to talk to these young men about how to do that in a healthy way, how to pursue a wife, and how to save what belongs to their future wife. And then two, we need to teach them not to have this unhealthy image or unhealthy expectations of their wife. Okay, and listen, I know some of you, kids watch these episodes with you, and obviously you just need to recognize that an episode about men's ministry is probably not going to be age appropriate for the kids to be sitting around listening to this. And so, when I bring up stuff like this, you probably just need to hit pause and, have them leave the room, whatever. But here's the thing. If we aren't talking to these young men about these conversations, and so I think the conversation shouldn't be to belittle the young man or beat him down. I think first of all is to say, okay, stop diagnosing yourself as that you're an addict of anything, okay? What we need to do is get disciplines in your life so that you can have the ability to restrain yourself. You shouldn't be acting on every impulse. Society says you should act on every impulse. Well, if they were raised to act on every impulse, well, don't be surprised when they act impulsively. So there needs to be some restraints and some constraints. That might mean that there needs to be an accountability partner who isn't going to be, if you will, condemning and constantly beating them down, but saying, look, hey, young brother, you got to have some escapes here. Okay, you have to have some points where you can flee these temptations. Okay, because these temptations aren't just going to be for this season; they're going to be for your entire life. Okay, and if you're going to understand what it means to overcome these temptations, you got to start now, even before you're married. If not, well, your marriage is going to shipwreck your marriage at some point. It just inevitably will. So we've got to have conversations about those things. There needs to be an openness about it. We don't need to be closed off about it, but we also don't need to have our young men running around saying, that they have a porn addiction. Now that may very well be a real thing for some young men. Okay, and by the way, some young women too. But we need to kind of bring them back and say, okay, now wait a minute. You create the image of God. If you're a Christian, you're born again. Okay, then what we need to do is we need to talk about the appropriate disciplines. Let's talk about what it means to be a servant of Christ and what it means to love your wife as Christ loved the church. They say, well, I'm not married yet. Well, God's called you to be a husband. Think about it. Now, there are some who are, look, singleness is not a calling and it's not a gift, but there are some who God does call to celibacy. Okay, that's different. I think that's the exception. But the rule is, as young man, he's called you to be a husband, and you need to position yourself so that you can be a faithful husband even now. Your faithfulness to your future wife starts now. And so we start having those conversations with young men and start talking about creating the necessary disciplines in their life. That needs to be part of men's ministry. We need to be open and have those conversations. I don't think in a way of like, well, again, I don't want to step outside of my area of expertise here, but I think that when you start these groups and basically, on Thursday night at 7 o'clock, the porn addicts meet at the church, well, everybody's looking who's walking in at 7 o'clock on Thursday night. And I can tell you, there's a lot of men that probably who are struggling with those issues who aren't going to be there. They're not going to come because there's no way they're going to address this issue that way. That's why a strong biblical men's ministry has the physical, the spiritual, and the mental component, which includes biblical mentors and biblical friends. Why? Because that's really where this conversation needs to be happening. That's really where this work is done, is an accountability. And that accountability means that, look, you enter in a covenantal relationship with the Lord as He's your king, you're His servant, but also the goal is to enter into a covenantal relationship with your wife. You enter into a covenantal relationship with your church, and then we see friendships as covenants where we hold each other accountable. Why? Because we need the brother to our left and to our right to be strong. So I could get into more on that, but I've talked a lot about men's ministry and the importance of the kind of recovering that strong biblical men's ministry. So look, if you want to invite me to your men's ministry event and you're getting pedicures or it's just another glutton feast, no thanks. Now, I will come and have breakfast with you. We'll have lunch. We'll have a meal together. But it better be a holistic thing where we're talking about these real issues. We're addressing them. We've got friends, mentors. We're dealing with the physical. We're challenging each other. Why? Because iron sharpens iron. And all this is for the glory of God and the glory of our King Jesus. So listen, men, in this year, 2025, stop making excuses. Stop with the nonsense. You're too busy. No, stop. Those who lead men's ministry, stop with this idea of the lowest common denominator and this effeminate approach. We need to return to strength, strong, biblical men. And that's going to require us to recruit and train men how to fight and how to win. Okay? Why? Because we're not losers. And Christians aren't losers. We don't lose down here. We win. Why? Because Christ is building his church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So there will be absolutely no retreat and no surrender.